The Garden of Eden, often known as Paradise, is a biblical paradise recorded in the book of Genesis as the site of man's creation. The story focuses on Adam and Eve, who are said to have been the first man and woman on earth. They were given the responsibility of watching over the tree of life in the Garden of Eden, but they disobeyed God's command and ate fruit from a tree that was off limits. This resulted in their expulsion from the garden. Based on the hints provided in the biblical text, many people have spent a significant amount of time looking for its location, but the answer to the age-old mystery may have finally been found. The biblical Garden of Eden is described as a paradise on earth that was cultivated by God and intended for his first two human creations, Adam and Eve, to live in. According to one school of thought, the name Eden comes from the Akkadian word edenu, which can be translated as plain. The biblical authors frequently refer to the garden as a luxurious area, which is one reason why it is sometimes referred to as the Garden of God. This is because the garden is mentioned in the biblical tradition, but the meaning of the garden as it is described in the Bible is what we will be focusing on today. Adam was the first man that God created, and he was created in the image of God. After God determined that Adam's solitude was not good, God allowed Adam to fall into a deep sleep and then fashioned Eve, the first woman, from one of Adam's ribs so that she could be his helper. It is vital to determine the location of the garden, the persons that played roles in it, and the events that took place within it in order to have a proper understanding of what the garden is to the narrator of Genesis. All of these things add to our comprehension of what the Bible means when it refers to the Garden of Eden. The story of Eden may be found in the book of Genesis, chapters 2, 4b to 3:24, where it is stated that the garden was located on the eastern side of Eden. However, the Hebrew text has Gan Beden, which is not in the construct form, and the preposition be in Beden is to be translated as in. Common translations have the phrase Garden of Eden with the constructed element of, but the Hebrew text has Gan Beden, which is not in the construct form. As a result, translating Gan Beden as Garden of Eden rather than Garden in Eden is a grammatical error. The right translation is Garden in Eden. There is some disagreement among academics on the precise location of Eden. However, many of them are of the opinion that the garden in question is located on another planet and was the dwelling place of the gods. In ancient Mesopotamia, the rivers Tigris and Euphrates were well known for their role in the production of irrigation systems in the surrounding area. The water that came from the garden served as the water supply for these two huge rivers. Thus, Mesopotamia is the most likely a place for the location of its site. Chapter: Locations and Features. According to Genesis 2:10-14, which provides a description of the garden, the water that came from Eden watered four significant areas: Pishon, which flows into the land of Havilah; Gihon, which flows into the land of Cush; Tigris, which flows into the eastern side of Assyria; and Euphrates, which is the fourth. In addition to this, it is reported that the garden contains any tree that is both pleasing to the eye and useful for sustenance. Yet there are specific references to two trees, the tree of life in the center of the garden and the tree of knowledge of good and evil on the outside of the forest. Genesis 2:8-9 and 3:1-3 place both trees in the center of the garden, but Genesis 3:22-24 suggests that perhaps both trees were planted on the east side of the garden, which is where Adam was located when was first put there. This inconsistency occurs at some point in the Genesis story. Even more, the description of the garden that is found in the book of Genesis is not the same as the description that is found in other biblical writings that make reference to the garden. For instance, the luxuriant materials that were discovered in the garden are not mentioned in Genesis 2:4b to 3:24, but they are described in Ezekiel 28. In the ancient Near East, the concept of a garden of a god or gods was a very prevalent metaphor for describing where the god or gods resided. Some of these explanations include the following. The narrator of the book of Genesis believed that the Garden of Eden was creatively formed for an etiological, meaning the origin or cause of things, purpose, not as a divine home, but of Adam and Eve, the first man and woman to live on earth. The first 11 chapters of Genesis are referred to as the primeval history, which compromises mythologies and traditions that were prevalent not only in Israel, but also across the rest of the ancient Near East. The classification is universally accepted in contemporary research. These myths and tales did not originate with the Israelites, but were instead appropriated by the authors of the Bible for the purposes of argumentation or rhetoric. The following are some of the most important questions that viewers should consider in order to correctly determine the Garden in Eden. What exactly is the point of the account of Eden that may be found in the book of Genesis. What was it that the storyteller hoped to accomplish? Importantly, in order to accomplish this objective, viewers shouldn't consider the Garden in Eden solely in terms of the characters playing roles in the narrative, such as God, Adam, Eve, the serpent, the singled-out trees, such as the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and especially the narrator's overarching purpose of the story. It would only serve to impede the progression of the story's plot if we concentrated solely on the garden without mentioning these other individuals. Chapter: Ancient Influence. It was very common practice in ancient literature to make use of symbols and metaphors. These literary devices contain components of rhetoric that are intended to convince people to accept what has been transmitted. To put it another way, ancient literature is not pointless. The whole expression of anything or things can be found in works. According to the earliest recorded literature attributed to the Sumerians, the myths involving the dwelling of a deity or gods in the ancient Near East typically take place in gardens. These texts date back to around 3500 BC. According to the book of Genesis, Adam and Eve are the ones who end up living in the Garden of Eden rather than God himself. This is sufficient to alert viewers about the readaptation of the garden concept by the narrator of Genesis, which is something that interpreters frequently leave out. Chapter: The Genesis Version. The narrator of the book of Genesis certainly stole the idea of a garden as an otherworldly place from Sumerian literature and used it for theological and etiological goals. In order to comprehend the account of the garden that is provided in Genesis, one needs to take into account the various locations and people who play important parts in the story. The purpose of the Dilmun Island was made abundantly apparent by the narrator of Genesis, and their audience was the intended recipient. However, according to the account in Genesis, both the occurrence of death and the problems that have arisen between God and humanity were only announced by God as a consequence of Adam and Eve's deliberate act of eating fruit from the prohibited tree of knowledge. In this account, death and the problems that have risen between God and humanity were a direct result of Adam and Eve's actions. It would appear that the Garden of Eden, much like the land of Dilmun, was a place of unending happiness where death did not exist. As a second consequence of Adam and Eve's disobedience, God sealed off the tree of life by stationing cherubim armed with flaming swords to guard it. This was done to prevent anyone from eating from the tree and gaining godlike power. A further significant improvement made by the narrator of Genesis's account of the Dilmun Island is the substitution of Adam and Eve for God as the inhabitants of the garden in place of God himself. The theological comment on this passage would be that in contrast to gods worshipped in other cultures, the God of Genesis is not a self-centered God. Rather, he is a God who actively sought to have a connection with human beings. Because Adam and Eve disobeyed God, their disobedience caused a rift in the connection that God had with humanity. In a nutshell, the Eden narrative in the book of Genesis can be understood to serve two different purposes, depending on how it is read. First, the story of Eden is preceded by the account of creation found in Genesis 1:1-2-4a, which concludes with the verse, "And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning a sixth day." The tale of Eden gives an image of the full creation as very good, with disruption, Adam and Eve's disobedience in Genesis 2:4b-3:24. This creates a contrast to the previous vision of the creation as very good. The tree of life and the tree of knowledge are two significant trees that God planted in the middle of the garden. Yet it is easy for us to forget about these trees. The so-called tree of knowledge has received significantly more focus than the tree of life. The narrative serves a number of purposes, one of which is to highlight the significance of the phrase tree of life. The only thing that God specifically forbade Adam and Eve to do was consume an apple from the tree of knowledge. Why did God not specifically forbid Adam and Eve to eat from the tree of life? This is the most important question. God gave them the command that they could eat the fruit of any tree, with one exception, the tree of knowledge. The narrator of the story about Eden has a reason to tell that Adam and Eve were also given access to the tree of life to eat from it. However, they disobeyed God's instruction and chose to eat from another tree instead. According to the narrator, the fact that evil exists in a world that was initially created as quite good is due to Adam and Eve's desire to become gods, which led to their pride. They have to choose life, obedience, above death, if they want to be the audience that the narrator has in mind, disobedience. Because Adam and Eve disobeyed God, their disobedience caused a rift in the connection that God had with humanity. Death or evil as a concept has crept into the world that Adam and Eve, and not God, was responsible for creating as very good. The human race is to blame for all evil. Second, the story of Eden might be seen as an etiological fable that attempts to provide explanations for problems concerning the origins of humans. The account of creation found in Genesis 1:1-2, 4a, has previously provided answers to issues about the cosmogony, which describes the activity that God did. According to the story of Eden, Adam and Eve were the first humans and also the first parents to give birth to humanity. They did this in the Garden of Eden. The legend of Eden is an example of the type of cosmogonic writing that was popular in the ancient Near East. Its purpose is to hypothesize about the beginnings of humanity and the location of its original home. It would appear that what one discovers in the section of Genesis titled Primeval History is a collection of fables about the beginnings of human science. These legends, of course, would contradict the scientific discoveries made in the 21st century CE. The first home for humankind was provided by God himself and was located in Eden's garden. In contrast to the stories told in Sumerian mythology, God did not plant the Garden of Eden for his own pleasure. Rather, he planted it for Adam and Eve. The narrator paints a picture of a God who is certainly not self-centered, but who is rather kind. According to Genesis, God's divine position was enhanced to the point where he did not require a physical abode, because doing so would simply interfere with his ubiquitous character. Based on the findings of the previous investigation, the Garden in Eden is not the Garden of Eden, but rather a garden in Eden. Based on the Hebrew translation of Gan Beden that was provided above, this implies that the specific garden in question was probably not the only one that existed in Eden. That's all we have for the video today. We will be right back with more such videos. Until then, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. Thanks for watching.